Anyway, just me rattling on. I should start this class. Now what was I trying to
It is
do?
usually fun to watch classical pianists. They're really good into it.
Yeah,
That's like an art.
I don't know. I guess if they're like really good, I would be attracted, like thinking about how fast they're going. How cool.
yeah. My dad was an orthopedic surgeon, and he liked classical music, but mostly he would just say, "Wow, can you? It's amazing how their fingers can move like that." I said, "Dad, if that's what you're paying attention to, right, what you like is bones and sinews, not music, you know." Anyway, okay, let's try to get started here. Can you hear me, teams, peoples? Oh, I haven't. Now I better share.
Yes.
Okay. And okay, so I ruined your mornings by sending you final exam questions. I apologize for that, but not really. So I wanted to go over them, find the typos maybe, and just make sure you understand what the drill is. So if we had had an in-class final, it would have been on Monday, December 6th, right up. And it would have been from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. So what I'm going to do is at 10 a.m., I will announce to you via an email which of the prompts I want you to respond to. You're going to need to respond to 4 of the 7. And with essays or responses, because don't do the essay has a topic paragraph and a concluding paragraph. Don't get trapped into that. Just answer the questions. So responses at least 750 words each. That's roughly 3 pages. In response to 4 of the following 7. I will give you a choice at that time out of at least 5 of them. That means you can safely ignore 1 in your preparation. Right? Because if you have to do 4 and I give you 5 to choose from, there's no way you'll have to write on 1 if there was 1 you didn't prepare, there's no way you'll have to write on that one. Now, obviously, and then they're going to be due 12:15 in 2.5 hours. So I am giving you every incentive to do your answers in advance so you don't try to compose them in the 2.5 hours or the 2 hours and 15 minutes of the actual exam time. So it's like a take home, right? Only I'll tell you which ones I need an answer to, right, during the time period. Okay, right, essays graded for accuracy and relevance of content, clarity, cogency, comprehensiveness in roughly that order. And you need to use at least 2 short quotations from our primary authors. That is to say, not Dimmock, but Hard, Dworkin, the other Dworkin, Rawls, etc. You have to upload to Canvas by 12:15. That gives you, a little more than the 2 hours, just in case you have upload problems or anything like that. And it will be run through the plagiarism checking software. Yeah. Oh, yes, I can. I actually can. There it is. Okay, so, the questions are just as were the last ones. For the most part, just explain what we've studied, in this class. So, first one is about Dworkin's critique of positivism. Present and explain Ronald Dworkin's critique of positivism. Be sure to discuss the significance for Dworkin of the positivist's view that judges have discretion in deciding so-called hard cases or penumbral cases. And the significance of his own claim that law contains principles in addition to rules. How does Dworkin support his view that judges need not be understood as creating law or rights, but only as finding them, even in hard cases? How does Hart respond to Dworkin's critique? Whose views do you think are better supported and why? Mill, a Mill question. What is Mill's liberty principle? To whom does it apply, and on what grounds does he defend it? How does he respond to the objection that his view rests on the untenable idea of acts that affect only the person engaging in them? Do you find his response adequate? Why or why not? Explain and elaborate on General Dworkin's claim to the effect that, given the basic value underlying Mill's only plausible argument for the liberty principle, paternalistic legislation is sometimes permissible. It says elaborate on that claim. One of the things you would do to elaborate on that claim is to explain the conditions under which it is permissible. So that's when, in short, people have irrational value assignments. And it's very hard to tell when a value assignment is irrational, or part of the answer is that it's when they have irrational value assignments, and it's very hard to tell when a value assignment is irrational as opposed to just, as it were, perverse, unusual. It disagrees with ours. Okay. 3, what is the difference between a paternalistic law and a moralistic one? Explain and elaborate on Devlin's argument for the claim that society may justifiably infringe on the liberty of its citizens to engage in acts that are immoral but victimless. Remember, his argument is that, well, right, because immorality has the same danger to society as sedition. Be sure to discuss, A, his claim that the law, in fact, always has made sheer immorality criminal. B, his claim that there can be no society without a public morality. And C, his notion of the internal morality of law. I'm sorry, that's not right. That's Fuller. I got to change that. I will resend this out corrected for this. It's always good to go through it and find out you screwed something up. Anyway, I will fix that, I promise. Do they need, so the 2 quotes per each essay, they do not have to be from different authors. But it would be really weird if you were to do 4 essays and all of the quotes were from the same author. Okay. Anyway, how does Hart respond to Devlin's arguments? Be sure to discuss the difference between positive and critical morality and the role this difference plays in Hart's argument. Whose view do you favor and why? And, give me philosophical reasons why, not, because I like that person's name more or something. 4th, present and contrast retributivists and consequentialists, as in Barnett's political accounts of justification of punishment. Okay. What are the basic problems for each sort of account? Present, compare, and contrast Morris's and Hampton's different views of the retributivist justification for punishment. How does Morris argue that wrongdoers have a right to punishment? How does Hampton criticize Morris's argument? What does she, that is Hampton, argue is the function of punishment, and on what fundamental? Discuss one you like and one feature you dislike about each of these 2 theories. Feature 5, explain and elaborate Barnett's claim that there is a, quote, crisis in the paradigm of punishment. Explain the basic elements of the alternative paradigm to punishment he proposes, and describe 3 ways, practical and or theoretical, in which it is better than the punishment paradigm. What problems do you see for the proposed alternative to punishment, and how do you think Barnett would respond? Finally, we get to stuff that we haven't covered yet. Present and discuss Rawls's account of the nature of civil disobedience and his views regarding the conditions under which such action is justified. Be sure to discuss Rawls's account of the conditions under which there exists a general obligation to obey law, to distinguish civil disobedience from conscientious refusal or evasion, and to contrast Dworkin's view of the justification for civil disobedience. Contrast Dworkin's view with Rawls's. Present, discuss, and evaluate Lyons's claim that the standard philosophical treatments of civil disobedience depend upon unacceptable moral judgments. Last question. This is the one that allows you to be creative and synthetic and not just carefully exegetical. Drawing on such writers as King, Rawls, Ronald Dworkin, and Lyons, discuss the question whether and under what conditions one has a political or legal, as opposed to moral or prudential, obligation to obey the law. Then explain the critical legal studies thesis as presented by Altman, that law is radically indeterminate, and present the grounds offered for that thesis. Finally, discuss the consequences of this thesis for the question whether there is a political obligation to obey the law. Questions? Sound like fun? Yeah, Sam.
So there was one reading somewhere in the last few weeks that we didn't take note. Remember what author that was?
Devlin.
It was Devlin, right?
Yeah. But I talked about it and you were assigned the reading, and you don't have to do that one if you don't want to. Okay. Anybody on the Teams meeting have any questions? Don't shoot me, I'm just the messenger. Okay. Is there a maximum word limit? 1,250 words maximum per essay. So no more than 5 standard pages. Should we say that? Is that okay? Do you care? Does anybody want more than 5 pages per essay? I mean, you could write a book on each of these things, so. I'll put in a maximum when I revise it in the light of that error and send it back out. I'll put in a maximum of 1,250 words per. Okay. Okay. Now let's get back to Rawls on civil disobedience. Where did I end last time? This one. Okay, so we did what I had to say about King, including the great praise as a moral leader that I gave him. Now, I heard a comedy bit on the radio yesterday about Martin Luther King, and in particular about how ironic it is that Martin Luther King preached nonviolence, but pretty much anytime you're in a city, if you're on Martin Luther King Boulevard, you're probably close to some violence. Anyway, that was clever. So, Rawls on civil disobedience and conscientious refusal, and this reading is from his magnum opus, A Theory of Justice. So in this reading, Rawls is going to acknowledge a basic moral obligation to follow the laws of a basically just state, even if those particular laws are not just. And in that, he's unlike King, who thinks if it's unjust, it's not a law. However, he's going to argue that some laws are sufficiently unjust in character that one may, and indeed perhaps should, refuse to obey them. Civil disobedience is a certain kind of such a refusal, but a very specific kind. He distinguishes it from other sorts of refusals to obey law. He gives an account of the conditions under which civil disobedience, understood as he understands it, is justified, and finally gives an account of its function within a basically just society. So how many of you have any exposure to Rawls's A Theory of Justice? Anybody in the chat theory or in the teams? Okay, I'm gonna have to give you the basics of the Theory of Justice, which is present in the reading. So he's generating principles of justice, adherence to which within a society is requisite to constitute it as a legitimate political entity. So if your society deviates significantly from honoring these principles of justice that he's going to articulate, right, it is not a legitimate political entity from his perspective. His moral assumptions are that persons are to be understood as free, rational agents entitled as such to equal basic respect. So it's a Kantian foundation. Methodologically, Rawls imagines what he calls the original position, which is a thought experimental position, right, in which persons deliberate behind what he calls a veil of ignorance about what rules they would agree to be governed by. So what's this veil of ignorance? The veil of ignorance means that no one knows any particular facts about their talents, their color, their sex, their amount of wealth, their particular desires, or those of anybody else in the society. You're ignorant of essentially everything that might distinguish you from anyone else in that society. And everyone is to be understood in the original position as equally ignorant of every particular thing about that might distinguish them from anyone else in the society. Okay. Now, you do know that wealth and talents and desires, etc., will be distributed in some way in the society. You just have no idea what way. So, under such a veil of ignorance, rational persons would agree, Rawls thinks, to be bound by two basic principles. The first one is the principle of equal liberty. Each person has an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. Every person has a basic right to the most basic liberty that's consistent with everybody's having the same amount of it. Second, inequalities in social primary goods, so that is inequalities in degrees of liberty, opportunity or of various sorts, income, wealth, and the bases of self-respect, are to be arranged so that they are both, first, so inequalities have to be, of social primary goods, have to be arranged so that they are to the benefit of the least advantaged. That is, any inequality must advantage the least well off. That is to say, you have a distribution of that makes some people well off, more well off than others. It has to be a distribution in which the least well off are also better off than they otherwise would be. So if you have a comparison between, everybody has $10, right? That's one system. Another one would be one in which half of the people have $100 and all the other people have only $10, well, that doesn't meet the difference principle because the worst off are not benefited by the inequality. But if it's that everybody or half of the people had $100 and everyone else had $15, that would benefit the least well off. That's the basic sort of idea. Okay. Principle one has priority over two, and oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get to B here, 2B. Social primary goods have to be attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. In particular, political offices have to be equally open to everyone, as do all other positions, right? Have to be equally open to everyone. Everyone has to have an equal, fair opportunity to whatever positions of offices and positions. So the first principle has priority over the second, and the equal opportunity principle has priority over the difference principle. Okay. From the fact that these are principles that rational agents would agree to be bound for mutual benefit, principles of fairness follow. Okay? A person is required on the basis of fairness to do their part as defined by the institutions when the institutions meet the principles of justice, are fair in the sense that they meet the principles of justice, and when they voluntarily accepted or taken advantage of the benefits that they provide. Okay. That's the principle of fairness. It follows from the justice of the institutions and your voluntary acceptance of the system, or you're voluntarily taking advantage of the benefits of the system. This is like Morris's obligation not to be a free rider. That obligation, as I said, depends upon the basic justice of the institutions and, in effect, your consent. Contrast with that, though, the natural duty to justice. This is a duty that you have to comply with just institutions when they do exist, and to seek to establish them where they don't. Okay. It's important to keep distinct the natural duty to justice from duties arising or obligations arising from the principle of fairness. Obligations, says Rawls, arise and rights arise from principles of fairness. From the principles of fairness, demand that individuals not free ride. Okay, but your duty to justice is not contingent upon the justice of a regime or a system, society, nor upon your consenting to accept its benefits. So you have a duty to justice, but obligations and rights arise from principles of fairness. You're going to have a duty to justice. You have a duty to justice whether you are a member of a just society or not. Okay. Now, the point of distinguishing the natural duty to abide by the demands of a just institution and the obligation to do so arising from the principle of fairness is just to emphasize that natural duties do not require that we have done anything to accept the burdens. We always have a duty to promote justice. However, we only have obligations when we incur them through some sort of voluntary acts. Accepting the benefits of an institution is one such act. The natural duty to justice is not conditioned on any such acceptance. You extend your natural duty to justice into an obligation by accepting the benefits of that just system. So you have an obligation to abide by a just system just because it's a just system. You have a duty to because you've accepted its benefits. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. You have a duty to because it's just. You have an obligation to because you've accepted its benefits. All right. Now, definition of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience, I'll abbreviate it CD. Yeah, Sam.
Whereas other authors we've read have made synonyms out of.
Yeah, he's distinguishing duty from obligation as in a technical way here to talk about duties as arising from, and you have a natural duty, but an obligation is something that is undertaken by voluntary actions. Okay, so civil disobedience is defined, right? Its aims here are to define civil disobedience, distinguishing it from other kinds of refusals to comply with the law, to account for when it is justified, and to explain its purpose. He again emphasizes that the problem of civil disobedience only arises within a more or less just democratic state, in which citizens recognize and accept the legitimacy of the Constitution, since that's the only sort of society in which there is a prima facie obligation to obey the law. That's the only sort of society in which arguably you have, by consent, right, agreed to the system and therefore undertaken the, and therefore the principles of fairness apply to you. The question then is, when does the duty cease to be binding in the light of the right to defend one's liberties and the duty to oppose injustice? So you imagine yourself in a basically just state, having both a duty to justice to conform to its dictates and an obligation to do so. But when does that obligation, as it were, cease to be binding in the light of the fact that you have a duty to defend justice that doesn't depend upon your obligation? So when does your duty to defend justice, as it were, override your obligation to conform to the state? Okay, that's the question. But now let's have a definition of civil disobedience. So it's important to unpack this. Civil disobedience is a public, nonviolent, conscientious, that is done out of conscious, yet political act, usually done with the aim of bringing about a change in the law or policies of the government. Okay, so what is all of this? There's a bunch packed in here. Civil disobedience is addressed to the majority's sense of justice and declares that in one's considered opinion, the law or policy in question does not respect the principles of justice. So we're talking about a society that's fundamentally just, in which the majority, indeed pretty much everyone, has a fundamental commitment to justice because of their agreement because they have a natural duty, right? and in light of, right, the majority's sense of justice as built into the fact that the society that they consent to be in meets the principles of justice, basically. Okay, so the civil disobedient then acts in such a way as to address the sense of justice of the majority. Okay, it's an appeal to the majority's sense of justice. And in that sense, it's a political act. It's directed at people in power based on, and this should say not a, based on and motivated by political principles. For that reason, these other features follow. It's got to be public. A private act cannot be an address to the majority's sense of justice. It also has to be nonviolent. The fundamental, right, principle or the fundamental notion of justice is, right, maximum liberty consistent with the same degree of liberty at all. Violence against others is intrinsically an infringement against justice. And so you cannot appeal to the sense of justice of the majority by means that violate justice, that in principle violate justice. Okay. The civil disobedient has to affirmatively believe the law or policy that they're seeking to address is unjust. That distinguishes the civil disobedient from a situation in which one violates a law so as to bring a test case to determine whether it's valid. That's right. You can think something is probably a just, law, but suspect that it might not be valid, right? Because not properly promulgated or violate, blah blah blah. That, right? If that's your beef and you want to get it tested by the courts, that does not count as civil disobedience. That's bringing a test case. As we'll see, that's pretty much what Dworkin thinks civil disobedience is. It's an excuse to bring test cases. Yeah, Sammy, had your hand up.
Yeah, so if we're appealing to the political principles, that's what makes CD a political act. The principles of justice are political principles.
Right. Okay.
Sometimes I think it seems like Rawls thinks those principles are a little bit.
Well, I mean, it's a political action in that it's directed at the people in power, but it's based on political principles. So the principles of justice are political principles. They are principles that must be established, must be in place for a system of government to be a legitimate one in his view. So now he later on sort of backs off and says, well, actually, I'm only talking about principles of justice for a Western-style democratic government. But in the principle of justice, he doesn't limit it to that, right? So he's effectively, in a theory of justice, he's essentially saying monarchies and non-democracies, theocracies, not legitimate states. Okay. Civil disobedience is a political act in being directed at the majority holding political power and in being based on and motivated by political principles. So it's not enough that the civil disobedience aim coincides with principles of justice. It has to be motivated by them, right? and not motivated, for example, by morality alone, or motivated, for example, by group interests. Okay, if you are disobeying the law because you don't like the way it treats your group and you want to overturn the law because it doesn't treat your group, unless, right, the reason you wanted to treat your group better is that your group is being treated unjustly, then what you're doing is not civil disobedience. It may be a political act in that it is attempting to affect policy, but it's not an act of civil disobedience in that because it's not addressed to the sense of justice of the majority. It's addressed to their willingness to give you what you want, which is different. Civil disobedience is also nonviolent in that it expresses disobedience to law within the limits of fidelity to law. So while the civil disobedient breaks the law, they express fidelity to law by the nonviolent nature of their act and by the willingness to suffer the penalty for the violation. That expresses the political nature of the act. This fidelity to law expressed in the willingness to be punished for the disobedience makes it clear that one is behaving out of conscience rather than out of, right, just you don't like the law or you'd rather not comply. Okay, so this definition then distinguishes civil disobedience from the raising of test cases and also from conscientious refusal. Conscientious refusal, as we'll see, doesn't involve an address to the majority's standards of justice. So you can engage in conscientious refusal out of, say, religious scruples about something. Okay, but that doesn't necessarily make an appeal to the majority's sense of justice. That's just between you and your God. That's not, right? That's not a political act in the same way. And it also distinguishes it from militancy, where the militant might not be appealing to the majority's sense of justice, and also, more than likely, isn't willing to suffer the, to accept the punishment for the violation. Okay, so that's what civil disobedience is. What then is conscientious refusal? Conscientious refusal is a principled refusal to comply with some direct legal injunction addressed to the person. So, for example, a pacifist's refusal to serve in a war, or a soldier's refuse to obey what he takes to be an unjust order. Okay. Now, one's refusal is generally assumed to be known to the authorities. I mean, after all, your draft board knows if you have shown up or not, right? Your commanding officer knows if you've done what's been ordered of you. But you might have liked to conceal it. And that distinguishes it right away from civil disobedience, which, if it's concealed, can't positively be an act addressed at the sense of justice of the majority. Conscientious evasion is different. That's conscientious evasion isn't a refusal to comply with the draft board. It's right, even though they know. Evasion is like dodging. Right? You right. The part of the point is not to have it known. So conscientious refusal is like writing a letter to your draft board saying, I refuse to be inducted because I have religious objections to this war. Running to Canada, that's evasion. conscientious refusal is distinct from civil disobedience in that it's not a political act addressed at the sense of justice of the majority. As I said, there is no need to appeal. There's no appeal to the sense of justice of the majority in conscientious refusal. It's also distinct from civil disobedience in that it may be based on principles that are not principles of justice, but like religious principles. Now, you may engage in conscientious refusal out of principles, because of your sense of justice. Okay, but unless you do it in a way that it constitutes a political act addressed to the sense of justice of the majority, it's not civil disobedience, it's conscientious refusal. But conscientious refusal might be based on religion or other principles as well. So this can pose a difficulty where the motives for refusal are religious, but where the religious principles coincide with principles of justice. Neither religiosity nor conscientiousness per se justify refusal. There is, right, however, a political role for civil disobedience that justifies treating civil disobedience as a political act differently from conscientious refusal or other refusals based on religion or conscience, even where those are engaged in order to change policy. So that's going to get, the point there is that there's something distinct about civil disobedience as he defines it that gives it a specific role in society that's different from that of conscientious refusal and might make it appropriate to, for example, treat civil disobedience different from conscientious refusers in whether you punish them or not, that kind of thing. In any event, the point of distinguishing civil disobedience from conscientious refusal is to make clear the political nature and justification of the former. But the line between them might not be entirely bright, and actions may have elements of both. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess going off of that, I guess I'm having trouble understanding why someone chooses to implement conscientious refusal when it also wants to. That's civil disobedience.
They might, but it's not a requirement. Conscientious refusal, all you need for conscientious refusal is to have a principled reason for not doing something that you're enjoined to do. You're not doing it isn't necessarily an appeal to the sense of majority of to the sense of justice of the majority with an aim of bringing about a change in policy.
So could there be motive not doing it? Has to be this.
You might just think it's against the will of God or something. That's not itself a matter of justice. But the point is that conscientious refusal needn't be a political act. That is to say, it need not be part of a way of trying to get the policy changed, let alone part of a way of getting the policy changed on the basis of making an appeal to the sense of justice of the majority. Yeah.
This kind of looks like it's based on an abstract claim by Rawls that there are some things, namely the two principles on which we can all agree, and then other things that we all might have reasons to agree upon, and then there are other things we just kind of accept or just believe, like a religious sentiment or the pacifist, I guess, point of view, and those ones I guess, we can't appeal to everyone on those bases because but I guess, what reason do we have to think that we all can agree upon the principle of justice
The veil of ignorance.
and not the?
Oh, well, because he doesn't think that anything follows about what theological views you might have. We don't agree on religion behind the veil of ignorance. We might agree not to allow it to have any sway in government or government policy, but we certainly don't agree on theological principles behind the veil of ignorance. But he thinks we would all rationally agree to those principles: fair equality, or basic equal liberty, maximum basic equal liberty, the difference principle, and fair equality of opportunity. He thinks those are just things that rational agents would come to agree upon as a basis for their society, but not this other stuff. I mean, it's a contentious point. I mean, he's, not everybody agrees with him. A lot of people think that what he says is too thin. So, for example, Susan Oken objects that Rawls pays too little attention to such matters as the arrangement of family, right? Family structures and their relation to the economic sphere. He thinks, people behind the veil of ignorance who don't know what gender or sex they're going to be would not agree to a situation in which domestic work was both unpaid and fell predominantly to women. They wouldn't agree to that, right? So that's anyway. Okay, so the justification of civil disobedience. Well, Christopher, so remember that we're dealing, Christopher says in the chat, I see no reason why you should willingly accept punishment, especially if you think a punishment is unjust, and that's why you're disobeying anyways. Well, but it's not that you think the punishment is unjust per se, it's that you think the law that you're protesting is unjust. And because your act is a political act within a basically just society, the fact of which gives rise to an obligation to obey the law, in order to show that you respect the basic society as a basically just society, that is to say, in order to express your general fidelity to law, which you have as an obligation following from principles of fairness, right? You accept the consequences of your act. Otherwise, what you're saying is there's a basic, what you're doing is denying that there's a basic obligation to obey the law. And that is to say, I reject the principles of fairness on which, and think I should get to free ride. Yeah.
Does Rawls say anything about how we know when the state is basically just? Like, it's just a simple thing the laws have to be principles of justice, or can some laws be so unjust?
It could be that some laws could be so unjust that they render the entire system unjust. A law that says a state that the current majority party in the House in the legislature in a state gets to draw legislative maps in ways that guarantee that they will have the same majority forever, despite having less than majority of the popular vote in the state. I think if that's right, that right there, that would do it for me. Say, oh, this isn't a society in which the equality of opportunity principle is in fact obeyed. Right? So that would fail to be a just society, and there would be no political obligation in such a society. There would be no basic obligation to obey the law. But we're talking about societies in which there is. And it will become a very pregnant question for us whether we live in a society that Rawls is talking about at all. Yeah.
Well, I guess it's more like, how would we know? I feel like, or what standard would we appeal to decide that we do?
Well, I mean,
I would do it for you, but I don't know. And not just like.
Yeah, I don't think that. I don't think there's a litmus test. I do think, though, that we can, think of it this way. There will be clear cases where whatever else may be said, the society is not fundamentally just. That's one thing. The second thing is, okay, let's suppose we're not quite sure. Still, we can say, okay, let's assume that there is a basic political obligation flowing from the basic justice of the society. This law or that law or this other law is a problem. When is it okay to violate the law in the mode of civil disobedience in order to address this or that particular unjust law? Okay. And this is what he says. Civil disobedience should be restricted to serious infringements of the first principle of justice and to blatant violations of the principle of equality of opportunity. Now that, again, that's what's a blatant violation and what's a, not quite blatant. What's a serious infringement of the first principle of justice and what's not a serious infringement? I mean, difficult questions. But some clearly would be. A law which said, black people have to live in these communities, in these communities, we're going to make them all live there. That clearly is a serious infringement of the first principle of justice. Okay? Women can't hold elected office. That clearly would be a blatant violation of the principle of equality of opportunity. He does say that it's not appropriate for violations of the difference principle because they are generally too hard to ascertain. It's too hard to tell when an inequality has or hasn't advantaged the least well off. Right? So, on the theory that a rising tide lifts all boats, then the really, really wealthy getting really, really wealthier is still potentially a benefit to those least well off. Not exploitative, it's a difference that's justified in light of its benefiting everyone. Okay, relatively speaking, they're not as benefited, but they're still benefited. And he just thinks it's very hard to tell when you have a genuine violation of the difference principle. It should also be restricted to situations in which ordinary channels for repealing the law and policies have been attempted in good faith and failed. First thing you do is you try to appeal to your legislature, et cetera, et cetera. And moreover, they have been tried and failed in a way that makes further such efforts makes them appear futile. This is like kings. First, you have to negotiate. Okay. Another restriction is that it has to be, you can't have a situation, you can't engage in civil disobedience where doing so would undermine a basically otherwise just state. And he's imagining here a situation in which civil disobedience would be equally well justified for a wide range of similarly situated groups who, if they all engaged in it, that amount of disobedience would undermine the fundamental justice of the state. So, right, the condition is always, to understand that it is the natural duty to justice which must motivate civil disobedience. And where engaging in civil disobedience would have a net negative effect on the justice of the society, you can't do it. That violates your duty to promote just societies and to create them where they don't exist. All right. Now, what about the justification of conscientious refusal? So mostly this, he talks about this in the context of wars. So, right, this is premised on the case of refusing to serve in a war or refusing to follow orders. This is premised on the injustice. It's got to be premised on the injustice of the war in question. Yeah.
All right, just on that last point, I have a question.
Yeah.
The commitment to secure justice, your natural duty to justice.
Right.
Does it also mean you have a natural duty to not promote injustice? You know what I mean? Like if you have a commitment to procuring justice in all your endeavors, does Rawls think that means you have I don't know, like a biconditional commitment to?
Well, I mean, let's put it this way. I think a better question would be, is it ever acceptable to do something that is per se unjust in order to bring about a greater amount of justice? I think that's a great question. I don't know that Rawls says anything about that. He might. But certainly, you have to be aiming for a net positive effect in terms of justice. But whether you can ever do something unjust, I mean, he does say you can't commit violence. Right?
It kind of looks like he's violating his.
How so?
Maybe if like.
Yeah, if you could commit an injustice in the name of greater justice, that would sort of, that would violate the categorical imperative, basically, to never treat persons as means only, right? So yeah, I suspect that's what he would say, even if net justice is improved in the situation. I suspect that's what he would say. Wait. That's okay. Justification of conscientious refusal, refusing to serve or refusing to follow orders. This gives him an opportunity to discuss the law of nations, which the principles of justice for the law of nations, which is sort of articulates justice between nations so as to indicate what kinds of wars between nations are and are not just. So, the principle of equality between states. Independent states have certain fundamental equal rights: the right to self-determination, the right of self-defense against attack and to form protective alliances, and the right that treaties be kept. Okay, so a just war will be fought only when, in defense of the right to self-determination, in defense against attack, defense of alliances, and in defense against violation of treaties. Those are the causes of just war. Notice, it is never just to conduct war for the acquisition of land or materials or conquest, right? Or even to protect human rights in a foreign land, it doesn't look like on this story. Moreover, even in a just war, some forms of violence are unacceptable. The less certain the justice of the war in question, the more restrained the means acceptable in prosecuting it, and the means by which it's pursued, and this is forms of violence that are unacceptable. The means by which it is pursued must not undermine the possibilities for a just peace. So a just war is always conditioned on its being conducted in such a way that it promotes a just peace. And indeed, a just peace is the aim of any just war. Conscientious refusal if it's motivated by these principles, may not be a political act because it might not be an address to the majority, but it can be justified on the basis of the natural duty to do justice. Now contrast here pacifism, which is just the view that no war is ever just. No one should ever participate in war. There can never be a just war. He says of the pacifist, right, who isn't basing, right, their refusal on these principles, but the sort of a different principle which says that war is always unjust, or unjustifiable, or must not be conducted. That person, says Rawls, doesn't have a justice-based principle. It doesn't have right. It isn't invoking the natural duty to justice in refusing to fight. They're relying on something else. But he says the pacifism is an otherworldly view that states can afford to tolerate, since it poses no more threat to the state than the celibacy of priests poses to the institution of marriage. I just love that. Love that. So pacifism isn't justified. Refusal to serve in a war on grounds of pacifism isn't justified by justice, but we can tolerate it because hardly anyone is actually a pacifist. Okay, final slide. Yeah.
Sorry, can you go back just so I have a couple questions. Does the principles of justice for the law of nations come also from some
From a veil of ignorance, but now we're thinking of nations.
yeah, like,
You know,
because it's I guess it's we would at least need to make an argument why we should think about that as like the source of the principles, or what we would at least need to make an argument for why it also works for like laws of nations.
yeah, and I'm sure he does, and it's just been too long. I don't quite remember what he says, and it's not part of our extract.
And
I looked over.
if we're appealing to those principles, which we ostensibly have all like accepted because they're principles of justice for the laws of nations, how like wouldn't CR just turn back into a political act and be civil disobedience at some point? Why is it your fourth bullet point? Why is it still not a political? Coming solely from the
Well, it's not a political act because you may not be trying to get any laws changed. You may not be you may not be making an appeal of any kind. Right? I mean, what makes it a political act is it's a public address to the majority in an effort to get them to change the rule. That's not what conscientious refusal is. It's assumed that it'll be known, but you're not out there yelling, hey, I'm refusing because I want you to see my sense that this is unjust and you should agree. That's not what a conscientious refuser does. If they were doing that, then that would be civil disobedience. Yeah. Okay. Finally, what's the political role of civil disobedience? Well, it's a call for others to reconsider their stance and to take seriously the possibility that a law or policy conflicts with basic principles of justice shared by all. And understood that way, it's just one among many political mechanisms that stabilize a just society on its path for self-correction. It's like free elections and an independent judiciary. It's another means to stimulate conscious reflection on where we should be headed in the light of the principles of justice that we share. Understood that way, it would make no sense in a society not structured around the idea of a system of cooperation among equals. If you live in a caste system that is not understood as a system of cooperation among equals, civil disobedience makes no sense. Right? It only makes sense in a system in which there's this idea of a cooperation among equals, because that's where the principles of justice foundational to a just state arise and where the corresponding obligations arise. If there's no fundamental obligation to obey the law arising from that kind of a system, right? Civil disobedience as a violation of an obligation which is nonetheless justified by appeal to shared principles of justice doesn't make sense. Now, there's the question at the end of Rawls, right? For us, right? Do we live in such a society? Do we live in a society that is in fact, and not just in word, structured around a system of cooperation among equals, in which we have, right, fundamentally, right, do we fundamentally respect the principles of maximum equal liberty and equality of opportunity? And if we don't, then it looks like this whole discussion is just irrelevant to us. Okay, so that's Rawls. Let's begin just a little bit talking about Dworkin. Come on, Mr. Cursor. Okay, so it's pretty simple for Dworkin. This is a very different view from Rawls. According to Dworkin,
Which Dworkin is this?
Ronald, the other one I don't like. I mean, the one I don't like. Right? Civil disobedience does need a justification. But not because as a violation, but not because it's a violation of law, the violation of which indicates an unfairness. So not because it violates an obligation of fairness. It does need an obligation, it does need a justification, but not for that reason. And the reason it doesn't need it for that reason, the reason it's not that reason, is that a civil disobedient, unlike a typical lawbreaker, he says, doesn't necessarily believe the law is valid. Okay? Now, he's using the term valid here deliberately. When you think heart, you think validity is a matter of meeting a rule of recognition. But when you think Dworkin, you think validity is a matter of, well, would Judge Hercules decide that, yes, the rights and duties articulated by means of this law are, in fact, part of our best story. So how can how can someone not have thought that, for example, the segregation laws were not valid? They were passed by the legislatures right? They were enforced by the police. They were enforced by the courts. What do you mean they're not valid laws? Hart would say, of course they were valid. They were immoral. They should not have been the law, but they were the law, right? Whereas Dworkin will say, oh, no, 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 no. Those were never valid because Hercules would have seen that they're not consistent with the best narrative we can tell about the development of our political system. Because principles, right? Principles are in there. Okay. So according to Dworkin, then, even what appear to be on the face of it valid laws, their validity may be doubtful, and civil disobedience is justified as a means of testing doubtfully valid laws. Given the doubtful validity of the law, or at least the civil disobedience doubt as to the validity of the law, the civil disobedient can't be accused of asserting a right to break valid law. That is, as asserting, right, the right to behave unfairly, accepting the benefit of laws without the burden of them. So the main context that he's talking about here is draft dodging / evasion in the context of the Vietnam War. So he wants to talk about, right, a doubtfully valid law. And that's his example, is the Vietnam draft. Given the Vietnam draft laws as an example of doubtfully valid law, or giving these, so for example, the war was conducted immorally, hence contrary to U.S. treaties. No act of war was ever declared by Congress. The United States interests in Vietnam were insufficiently weighty to permit a draft, which is an unequal burden because it falls on young men, right? Requiring weighty reasons. And so it violates, because the reasons weren't weighty enough, he thinks it plausibly violated due process and the Fifth Amendment and equal protection. The policy of exempting college students from the draft show further equal protection violation. This is another reason to think that the draft was not legal, was not valid. The religious exemption distinguishes between religious and moral objections, and therefore it irrationally constitutes a violation of the separation of church and state. You couldn't refuse the draft on moral grounds, but you could on religious grounds. That's a Establishment Clause violation. So there are all these reasons for thinking that the draft was immoral. The draft policy made it criminal to advocate draft evasion, which is a free speech violation. There are all these reasons to think that it was not a valid law. So that's the test case. Yeah.
So he's talking about civil disobedience against the draft dodgers, which is something that both Rawls and King.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and so really, he's talking more generally about law breaking as a means of having the function where it has the function of challenging dubiously valid laws. So that doesn't necessarily, I mean, in a sense, if it's in order to get a challenge going to a law, that in a way counts as political. It's expressive. It makes no sense to do that privately. Okay, if your point is to challenge, to bring a court, to do something that will result in a court case that will challenge, in which you can raise a challenge to the validity of the law, it makes no sense to, for example, try to get away with it undetected. So it's a political kind of act in that way. But it needn't be expressly directed at shared principles of justice. That depends upon whether and to what extent the shared principles of justice are sort of what Hercules would have appealed to in deciding this case, right? So whether those are the relevant principles which he understands as incorporated into the law, in addition to the particular rules that the law has. Anyway, we have to stop there because it's time. We'll pick it up here and we'll get through Lyons and maybe even start on Altman next time, in addition to talking about, I'll give you an opportunity to quiz me about the exam, etc., or exam me about the quiz, or whatever you want to call it. Okay, great. Have a happy Thanksgiving. Don't eat too much. Yes, of course you will.